That night, Boston was drowning in cold rain. Streetlights blurred behind sheets of water. Tires hissed across the black pavement. Outside St. Matthew's Children's Hospital, a black sedan pulled sharply up to the emergency entrance. Before the driver could step out and open the door, an older woman pushed it open herself. Her name was Elizabeth Whitman. At 62, Elizabeth still carried herself like a woman who expected rooms to go quiet when she entered them. Her silver hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head. Her long black coat fell straight to her knees. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement with the same sharp rhythm that had followed her through boardrooms for nearly 40 years. People in Boston knew her name. People in medicine knew it even better. Elizabeth Whitman was the chairwoman of Whitman Medical Technologies, one of the most powerful medical device companies in the Northeast. Her company's monitors, surgical systems, and diagnostic tools sat inside hospitals across the country. She had stood on stages and spoken about innovation, about saving lives, about the future of healthcare. But that night, none of it mattered. She did not walk into the hospital as a CEO. She walked in as a grandmother who might lose the child she loved most. The automatic doors slid open. Warm air rushed out, carrying the smell of antiseptic, wet coats, and old coffee. A nurse looked up from the desk and froze. "Mrs. Whitman?" "Lily Whitman," Elizabeth said. Her voice was hoarse, but still controlled. "My granddaughter, 6 years old. She was brought in tonight." The nurse did not ask another question. She stood and led Elizabeth down a bright white hallway. Elizabeth's heels struck the tile floor. In any other place, that sound would have made people move aside, but in the emergency wing, nobody cared who she was. A father sat with his head in his hands. A mother whispered into a phone, crying so quietly it almost looked like prayer. A doctor rushed past with a file tucked under his arm. Here, titles had no weight. Here, money could not slow down time. Elizabeth turned into the pediatric intensive care unit and saw her daughter standing beside a glass wall. Claire Whitman was 32. Her pale blonde hair was tied loosely at the back of her neck, and the shoulders of her gray sweater was still damp from the rain. Her face was white with fear. Her eyes were red from crying. When she saw her mother, she did not run into her arms. She only whispered, "Mom." "Where is she?" Claire turned toward the glass. Inside the room, Lily lay in a narrow hospital bed, almost swallowed by white blankets, wires, tubes, and machines. Her thin blonde hair clung to her forehead. Her eyes were closed. Her small chest rose and fell with the help of the equipment beside her. Elizabeth stopped moving. All her life, she had trained herself not to react. Not when investors questioned her. Not when journalists attacked her. Not when board members tried to corner her in private meetings. But seeing Lily like that broke through every wall she had built. "What happened?" Elizabeth asked. Claire swallowed hard. "She collapsed at school. At first, they thought she was just dehydrated. Then her heart rhythm went out of control. The doctors found something they missed before. A defect, a complication. They said..." She could not finish. Elizabeth turned sharply toward the doctor standing nearby. He was in his 50s, thin, exhausted, and wearing the careful expression of a man who had already given too much bad news that night. "I want the best surgeon," Elizabeth said. "Now." The doctor looked at her for a long second. "Mrs. Whitman, we have already contacted 3 pediatric cardiac surgeons." "And?" "The first cannot get here in time. The second reviewed the scans and declined the case. The third said the risk was too high." Elizabeth stared at him as though he had said something absurd. "I did not ask whether they were afraid. I asked, who can save my granddaughter?" "That is the problem," the doctor said softly. No one wants to open a case they believe the child may not survive.
I can't.
Claire covered her mouth. Elizabeth stepped closer. I can pay anything. The doctor did not look away. Mrs. Whitman, this is not about money. For a moment, Elizabeth said nothing. Since she was young, she had believed there were only two kinds of problems in the world: problems solved by discipline and problems solved by money. If neither worked, then the person handling the problem simply was not good enough. But that night, a doctor looked her in the eye and told her that her money had no power. It terrified her. And because it terrified her, it made her angry. I funded the new surgical wing in this hospital, she said. I know. My company helped install the equipment you are using to keep my granddaughter alive. I know that too. Then find someone. The doctor was silent. Then he said, There is one more. Elizabeth grabbed onto those words like a drowning woman reaching for the edge of a boat. Who? Dr. Mason Carter. The name meant nothing to her. Carter was common. Mason was ordinary. Call him. We already did. He is on his way. Is he good? The doctor glanced toward Lily's room. If anyone in this city has the hands and the nerve to try this operation, it is him. Claire whispered, Try? No one answered. 17 minutes later, the doors at the end of the hallway opened. A man stepped inside. He was in his early 30s, tall, lean, brown hair slightly damp from the rain. His face was pale under the hospital lights, and his expression was calm in a way that made the room seem to shift around him. He did not rush. He did not try to impress anyone. He simply walked toward the doctors waiting for him. On his white coat, a small badge read, Dr. Mason Carter, Pediatric Cardiothoracic Surgery. Elizabeth looked at the name, then at his face. Nothing. She did not recognize him. But Mason Carter recognized her the moment he saw her. He stopped in front of Elizabeth. His eyes moved over her face, her silver hair, her expensive coat, and then, very briefly, down to her black heels still marked with tiny drops of rain. A small detail, an old memory, a winter morning from 20 years ago. Mason said, Mrs. Whitman. Elizabeth lifted her chin. Dr. Carter, my granddaughter is dying in that room. I need you to save her. Mason looked at her for one more second. Then he said something that made the hallway feel colder. It has been a long time. Elizabeth frowned. I'm sorry. Have we met? Mason did not answer right away. He looked through the glass at Lily, small and innocent and completely separate from the sins adults carried with them. Then he turned back to Elizabeth. Yes, he said, but you didn't really look at me. Before Elizabeth could understand what he meant, the past began to return. Not all at once, just in fragments. Snow, a leather glove, newspapers scattered across stone steps. A boy's voice sang, I am helping myself. And a sentence Elizabeth had spoken long ago, so carelessly that she had forgotten it. But the boy had not. 20 years earlier, Boston was cold in a different way. Not the wet cold of rain, but the sharp, dry cold of January, when old snow turned gray beside the curb and every breath rose like smoke. Mason Carter was 11 years old. He was not the kind of child people noticed in a busy city. He was small for his age, with narrow shoulders, messy brown hair, and a faded knit hat pulled low over his ears. His dark blue coat was too thin for winter. His gloves did not match. One was black, the other grey, and both were worn through at the fingertips. He stood near the entrance of Whitman Tower, a glass building in Boston's financial district, where important people hurried in and out without looking down. In his arms was a stack of old newspapers. They were not even that day's papers. Mason had collected clean leftovers from a newsstand near the train station and asked the owner if he could sell them for spare change. Some people bought one out of pity. Some shook their heads. Some walked faster when they saw him. But that day, Mason could not go home empty-handed. His mother, Margaret Carter, was sick. She lay in a small rented room in South Boston, burning with fever and coughing so hard that sometimes she could not breathe. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning hotel rooms in the morning and washing dishes at a diner at night. 3 weeks earlier, the cough had started. 1 week earlier, she had fainted in the kitchen. The day before, a doctor at a free clinic had told them she needed medicine immediately. Mason had counted the money in the tin box on their kitchen table. It was not enough. He had asked the landlord for more time on rent. The man shut the door in his face. He had asked a neighbor to sit with his mother. She agreed, but all she could give him was half a loaf of bread. So Mason stood outside Whitman Tower in the freezing wind, trying to sell 1 paper at a time. He did not want to beg. His mother had told him, "You can be poor, Mason, but don't let anyone take your dignity. If you need help, ask honestly. If you can work, work." So he worked. He held out the papers with numb fingers and said to strangers, "Newspaper, sir, just 50 cents. Ma'am, would you like one? Please, my mom is sick." Sometimes that last sentence made people walk away faster. At 8:45 a.m., a black car pulled up in front of the tower. The back door opened. Elizabeth Whitman stepped out. She was 42 then, and at the height of her power. Her ash-blonde hair was smooth. Her charcoal suit was perfect. A cream cashmere coat rested over her shoulders. Her black heels shone so brightly they reflected the dirty snow beneath them. She was on the phone. "No, I don't want to hear the word maybe. Either the board signs today or we withdraw the entire proposal." Her assistant, Linda, followed closely behind, carrying a thick folder. "Mrs. Whitman, the meeting starts in 10 minutes. "I know when the meeting starts, Linda." Elizabeth's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Mason saw her from a few feet away. He did not know who she was, but he knew what kind of person she seemed to be. The kind who could buy every paper in his arms and never notice the money was gone. He stepped forward. "Ma'am, would you like a newspaper?" Elizabeth did not look down. He took another step. "Please, ma'am, my mom needs medicine. I'm trying to—" At that moment, Elizabeth pulled one leather glove from her hand to check something on her phone. The glove slipped from her fingers and fell onto the snowy pavement beside the car. Mason saw it. He bent down and picked it up. "Ma'am, you dropped this." Elizabeth kept walking, the phone still pressed to her ear. Mason ran after her. He was not fast on icy stone. One sole of his old shoe had begun to peel away. As he stepped onto the front steps of Whitman Tower, his foot slid. He fell forward. The newspapers burst from his arms, the glove flew out of his hand, and dirty slush splashed across Elizabeth Whitman's polished black shoes. Everything stopped. Elizabeth looked down. Mason scrambled to his knees. His palms burned from hitting the cold stone, but he barely felt it. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I was only trying to give this back." He picked up the leather glove and held it out with both hands. Elizabeth looked at the glove, then at the boy. For the first time that morning, she truly looked at him. But she did not see a child. She saw an old coat, dirty shoes, newspapers on the steps, a smear of slush across expensive Italian leather. "Do you have any idea how much these cost?" she asked. Mason froze. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." Linda stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitman, we have 8 minutes." Elizabeth took a tissue from Linda, bent down, and wiped the slush from her shoe. Her movements were precise and cold, as if she were correcting a mistake in a contract. Mason watched her. Then he swallowed. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I'm not trying to bother you. I just need a little money for my mom's medicine. She's really sick. I can sell you all the papers, or I can clean your shoes. I can—" Elizabeth looked up. "There is always a story." Mason stopped. A sick mother, a hungry brother, a cold morning, bad luck. People always have a reason. My mom really is sick. Then where is your father? Mason lowered his eyes. He left. Of course. She said it quietly. That somehow made it hurt more. I'm trying, Mason said. I've been here since morning. Elizabeth stood straight, the dirty tissue still in her hand. Listen carefully. The world does not reward excuses. If your mother needs help, someone in your family should have made better choices before it came to this. Mason stared at her. He was 11 years old. He did not have the words to defend his mother against a woman in a cashmere coat who spoke as if she understood his whole life. Kindness, Elizabeth said, is not for people who refuse to help themselves. Mason lifted his head. His eyes were wet, but he did not cry. I am helping myself. For a second, Linda looked at him as if she wanted to say something. But Elizabeth had already turned away. Give him nothing, she told her assistant. If you feed weakness, it grows. Then she walked inside. The revolving glass door closed behind her, swallowing the warmth, the light, and the scent of expensive perfume. Mason stood on the steps. Snow began to fall again. People stepped around him. A man picked up one of the wet newspapers, looked at it, and dropped it back down as if it no longer had value. Mason looked at the leather glove in his hand. He could keep it. He could sell it. It was probably worth more than all the newspapers he carried. Maybe it would be enough to buy the medicine. But he remembered his mother's voice. If we are poor, we must guard our hearts even more carefully. So Mason stepped up to the door and placed the glove on the stone ledge where Elizabeth would see it when she came out. Then he gathered the newspapers that were still dry. His hands shook, not only from the cold.
By noon, he had earned $8.35. It was not enough. Still, he ran to the pharmacy. The pharmacist looked at the prescription, then at the coins and bills Mason pushed across the counter. I'm sorry, kid. Please, Mason said. I can bring the rest tomorrow. I can't do that. My mom needs it. I know, but I can't. Mason stood there until the customer behind him grew impatient. Move, kid. He gathered the money and ran home. When he opened the door to their room, he heard his mother coughing. Margaret Carter lay on the narrow bed beside the window. Her face was pale. Her hair was damp with sweat. A neighbor had left a bowl of soup on the table, but it had not been touched. Mason ran to her side.
Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't get enough. I'll go back. I'll find another place, I promise. Margaret opened her eyes. Come here. Mason knelt beside the bed. She reached up and touched his cheek. Her hand was burning hot. You're freezing. I'm fine. Don't lie to your mother. He gave a tiny laugh, but tears spilled down his face. I tried. I know. I've really tried. I know, baby. Mason lowered his head to the edge of the blanket. A woman today said, kindness isn't for people who refuse to help themselves. Margaret was quiet. Then she brushed his hair away from his forehead. Do you believe her? Mason did not answer. He did not want to. But when adults spoke with enough certainty, children often wondered if maybe they were the ones who were wrong. Margaret lifted his chin. Look at me. Mason looked at her. Sometimes, people who have everything convince themselves they built it alone. They forget that every person on earth was once carried by someone. Every person has needed a hand. She started coughing. Mason hurried to pour her water. When the coughing stopped, she was weaker. Don't let this world make you hard, Mason. Don't let this world make you hard. He wiped his face with his sleeve. What if it already has? She smiled sadly. Then let it make you strong instead. That night, Margaret Carter was taken to the hospital. Mason sat in the waiting room for hours, his wet shoes planted on the tile, his knit hat held tightly in both hands. He heard wheels rolling past, nurses calling names, someone crying behind a closed door. Finally, a doctor came out. He knelt in front of Mason because Mason was only a child. Mason, he said gently, your mother is very weak. We are going to do everything we can. Mason nodded, though he did not fully understand. Margaret lived for 3 more days. During those 3 days, Mason sat beside her bed and read to her from the old newspapers he had not sold. Sometimes she was awake. Sometimes she drifted. Sometimes she thought Mason was younger than he was and called him my little bird. Sometimes she held his hand so tightly it felt as if she were afraid the world would pull him away. On the 3rd morning, the snow stopped. Weak white light slipped through the hospital curtains. Margaret opened her eyes. Mason, I'm here. Promise me something. Anything. Don't spend your life proving cruel people wrong. He did not understand. She struggled to breathe. Spend it becoming someone they should have been. Those were the last full words she ever spoke. That afternoon, Margaret Carter died. Mason did not cry right away. He sat beside the empty bed for a long time, staring at the blanket after it had been pulled flat. In his mind, he heard 2 voices. One was cold. Kindness is not for people who refuse to help themselves. The other was weak but warm. Don't let this world make you hard. He did not know what kind of man he would become. But from that day on, whenever Mason passed Whitman Tower, he no longer looked up at the shining windows. He looked down at the shoes of the people walking out, and he wondered how many lives had changed simply because someone had chosen to stop. No one becomes a surgeon because of a single promise made beside a hospital bed. Especially not an orphan, with no money, no father, no wealthy relatives, and no doors already open for him. After his mother died, Mason entered the foster care system. He lived with 3 families in 4 years. Some were kind. Some took children because the state sent a check. In one house, he had his own bed. In another, he slept on a couch beside a heater that rattled all night. But Mason studied. He studied as if every page were a brick in a bridge out of the life he had been given. At school, he was quiet. At lunch, he sat at the end of the table with a biology book open in front of him. Some kids called him Doctor Boy as a joke. He never argued. At 16, he worked in a library. At 17, he got a part-time job at a community clinic. He swept floors, filed papers, pushed wheelchairs, and cleaned examination rooms. He liked the smell of antiseptic. It reminded him of the hospital where his mother died. But it also reminded him that in rooms like those, some people were saved. One evening, the clinic doctor, Dr. Helen Morris, found Mason staring at a diagram of the human heart on the wall. "Do you like medicine?" she asked. Mason said, "I like things that can be fixed." Dr. Morris studied him. "Not everything in medicine can be fixed." "I know. Then why do you still like it?" Mason looked at the drawing of the heart. "Because some things are worth trying to fix anyway." Dr. Morris was the first person to write him a recommendation letter. She was also the first person to tell him that he had something rare. Not just intelligence, stillness. "You don't panic when everyone else does," she told him. "Operating rooms need people like that. But remember, Mason, steady hands do not require a cold heart." He never forgot that. He earned a scholarship to college, then medical school, then residency. Every step cost him something. There were nights when he fell asleep over textbooks, days when he ate stale bread in a hospital break room because he had no time or money for anything else. Moments when he watched classmates receive calls from parents, money from home, care packages during holidays, and felt the empty space in his own life open wide again. Still, he kept going. During his second year of residency, Mason assisted in an emergency procedure for a 5-year-old boy with a severe heart complication. The operation lasted until nearly morning. When the child stabilized, his mother broke down and kissed the attending surgeon's hands. Mason stood behind them, so tired he could barely feel his legs. Dr. Morris, visiting that day, looked at him. "Do you understand now?" "Understand what?" "Why we try." From then on, Mason chose pediatric heart surgery. Not because it was easy. It was not. It was brutal in its own quiet way. The patients were small. The risks were enormous. Every decision could change a family forever. But Mason believed that if he could stand between a child and death, even for a few hours, then his life would no longer be only the story of a boy left outside Whitman Tower. It would become the story of children someone had stopped for. While Mason built his life through exhaustion, discipline, and sleepless nights, Elizabeth Whitman built her empire through contracts, strategy, and power. She did not remember the boy on the steps. Or perhaps she had placed him in a locked room of memory, where small, inconvenient things were stored and forgotten. The meeting that morning had been a success. Whitman Medical Technologies won the contract. The stock price climbed. Newspapers called Elizabeth a rare force in the industry, a woman who had risen from an ordinary middle-class background to the top of medical technology through intelligence, discipline, and ruthlessness. She liked that word. Ruthless. It sounded better than cruel. As the years passed, Elizabeth became more successful, and success hardened her beliefs. She believed strong people survived, weak people complained. She believed charity should be given only to those who proved they deserved it. She funded scholarships, but only for perfect students. She donated to hospitals, but always with the company name displayed on a wall. She attended fundraisers, but rarely looked into the eyes of the people being helped. She did not hate the poor.
She hated feeling as though anyone needed something from her without being able to give anything back. Her daughter Claire grew up in a beautiful house in Beacon Hill, with a mother who appeared more often in magazines than at the dinner table. Claire loved her mother, but loving Elizabeth often felt like standing before a stone wall. You could touch it. You could not get through. When Claire was little, Elizabeth once told her, "Never let anyone pity you." Claire had asked, "What's the difference between pity and love?" Elizabeth had not answered, perhaps because she did not know. When Claire married and gave birth to Lily, something in Elizabeth softened. Not completely, just enough for Claire to notice that there was still a narrow door inside her mother that had never fully closed. Lily was the only person who could make Elizabeth sit on the floor in an expensive dress to build towers out of blocks. Lily was the only one who could call her Grandma Ellie without making her frown. Lily could stick a glitter star on the back of Elizabeth's hand, and Elizabeth would wear it through an entire video meeting with lawyers. Once, Lily asked, "Grandma, why do people say you're scary?" Elizabeth looked at her. "Because they don't listen the first time." Lily giggled. "I'm not scared." "I know. Because you're soft inside." Claire heard it from the kitchen doorway and froze. Elizabeth stayed silent so long that Lily thought she had not heard. But she had. And perhaps some hidden part of her wanted it to be true. Then Lily collapsed at school on an October afternoon. At first, Claire thought she was only tired. Lily had been practicing for the school's fall performance. She had twirled across the small gym stage in a yellow dress, then suddenly stopped and pressed one hand to her chest. The teacher ran to her. Claire got the call at 3:12 p.m. Elizabeth got the call at 3:20. By 4 o'clock, Lily was at St. Matthew's. By 6, the doctors knew it was worse than anyone had feared. By 8, 3 specialists had declined. By 9:17 p.m., Dr. Mason Carter walked into the hallway. And the past walked in with him. Elizabeth was not used to being looked at like a question. She was used to being looked at like an answer. In meetings, people looked to her to know whether to sign. At fundraisers, they looked to her to know when to clap. In the medical industry, they watched her to guess where the next river of money would flow. But Mason Carter looked at her as though he were looking at an old locked room. Not with rage, not with contempt. Recognition. And somehow, that troubled Elizabeth more than accusation. "Dr. Carter," she said, trying to pull the moment back into order. "If we have met before, I apologize for not remembering, but right now my granddaughter needs you." Mason did not react to the tone. He took Lily's chart from the attending physician. He read the scans. He turned a page, asked 3 short questions. None of them were about money. None were about Elizabeth. "When was the first arrhythmia?" "Around 3:20. "How did she respond to medication?" "Temporarily. Not enough to maintain stability." "Current pressure?" The assisting doctor answered. Mason studied the film for another moment, then said, "Prep OR3. Full pediatric cardiac team. Call Dr. Larson for anesthesia. No one enters the room unless they are essential." Claire held her breath.
You're gonna operate?
"You'll operate?" Mason looked at her. His eyes were gentler with Claire. I will try. But you need to understand, this is extremely high risk." Claire nodded, tears spilling down her face. "Please save her."
I will do everything I can.
"I will do everything I can." Elizabeth stepped forward. "Whatever you need, I can provide it. Equipment, specialists, funding, anything." Mason looked at her. "I need you to wait." The sentence struck Elizabeth like a small, polite slap. "I can help." "No," he said, "you can't." She opened her mouth, but Claire gripped her hand. "Mom, please." Elizabeth stopped. Mason turned to leave, then paused after 2 steps. He looked back at her. "You still don't remember me." "I told you Whitman Tower, January, 20 years ago. A boy selling newspapers outside the entrance. He got slush on your shoes." The hallway seemed to freeze. Elizabeth stood very still. It was not that she remembered everything at once. Memory did not return like a door thrown open. It came back as a crack in ice. Snow. A glove. Newspapers on the steps. A muddy mark on her shoe. A boy saying, "I am helping myself." Her face lost color. Mason continued, his voice calm. "You told him kindness was not for people who refused to help themselves." Claire turned toward her mother. "Mom?" Elizabeth did not look at her daughter. She looked at Mason. For a moment, she no longer saw the surgeon standing in front of her. She saw a skinny boy in a thin coat, holding out her leather glove with both hands. She said, but her voice was no longer firm. "I didn't know your mother was really sick." Mason looked at her. "No, you didn't ask." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Claire released Elizabeth's hand. Elizabeth felt it, and for the first time in many years, she understood how quickly power could vanish. No one shouted. No one dragged her down from a stage. One quiet sentence, and suddenly she was exposed in front of her own child. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Mason did not answer. He looked toward Lily's room. "Your granddaughter had nothing to do with that." Elizabeth swallowed. "No, she didn't." "Then I'm going to save her." He walked away. Elizabeth called after him. "Dr. Carter!" Mason stopped. She wanted to say something powerful, a complete apology, a promise, an offer. But in that moment, every language she knew, contracts, money, negotiation, authority, became useless. All she could say was, "Please." Mason looked at her. Not at the CEO, not at the woman who had hurt him, at a grandmother who was terrified. He nodded once. Then he entered the operating wing. The doors closed. A red light came on above them. Surgery in progress. Elizabeth stared at it. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to do but wait. Claire sat down, trembling. Elizabeth tried to sit beside her, but Claire would not look at her.
"Was that true?"
"Is it true?" Claire asked. Elizabeth stayed silent. "Mom, yes." Claire closed her eyes. "Oh my God. Claire, I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't ask. That is what he said." The sentence returned a second time, heavier than before. Elizabeth sat across from her daughter. The hospital hallway was too bright. The light made every line on her hands visible. She looked down at them. Hands that had signed million-dollar deals. Hands that had shaken governors' hands and hospital presidents' hands. Hands that had held Lily. And hands that had once clutched a tissue to wipe a shoe instead of reaching toward a child. Claire said, "Tell me." "Not now." "Now." Elizabeth looked at her daughter. Claire's eyes held more than anger. They held years of disappointment. Dinners missed, tears dismissed. A lifetime of being told to be stronger when what she needed was a mother who could be soft. So Elizabeth looked toward the operating room doors. And she told the story. She told Claire about the winter morning, the glove, the shoes, the boy selling newspapers.
But as she spoke, she realized how much she did not remember. She did not remember the color of his coat. She did not remember how badly his voice shook. She did not remember whether his hands were scratched. She did not remember how he gathered the fallen papers. She only remembered the shoes. That truth shamed her in a way she had never experienced. Claire listened without interrupting. When Elizabeth finished, Claire's face was wet with tears, but her voice was cold. "You thought you were teaching him a lesson?" Elizabeth whispered. "Yes." "No, Mom. You were proving you didn't have to care." Elizabeth lowered her head. Inside the operating room, Mason stood beneath the white surgical lights. His hands were gloved. His breathing was slow. Lily lay before him, a 6-year-old child he had only seen through glass. He looked at the monitor. Her rhythm was unstable. The anesthesiologist said, "We have very little time." Mason nodded. "I know." A nurse asked quietly, "Are you all right?" Mason looked at her. "I'm all right." But when the scalpel was placed in his hand, for one brief second, he was no longer in the operating room. He was back in a hospital waiting area 20 years earlier, a boy of 11, holding a knit hat in both hands, waiting for a doctor to come out and tell him his mother might live. Then his mother's voice came back. "Don't let this world make you hard."
Mason took one slow breath. He looked at Lily. This child was not Elizabeth. This child had not stood on those steps. This child was only a small heart asking for someone brave enough to try. Mason said, "Begin." The surgery lasted longer than anyone expected. 1 hour. 2. 3. Outside, time changed shape. The clock kept moving, but every minute felt like a season. Claire sat bent forward, hands clasped, lips moving without sound. Maybe she was praying. Maybe she was counting breaths. Maybe she was simply trying not to fall apart before she knew whether her daughter would live. Elizabeth sat 2 chairs away. It was not a large distance, but to her it felt like a river. Hospital staff passed through the hallway. A few recognized her. On any other day they might have greeted her. That night they glanced at her and kept walking. Nobody needed Elizabeth Whitman here. Her phone kept vibrating. Her assistant called. Board members sent messages. An international meeting had been postponed. Rumors were already moving through the circles that fed on the troubles of powerful people. Elizabeth turned the phone off. It may have been the first time in 20 years she had done that while not on an airplane. Without a screen to look at, she had no choice but to look at herself. Memory kept returning. The boy gathering newspapers, Linda watching as if she wanted to speak, the leather glove left on the stone ledge. Elizabeth remembered leaving the building after the meeting that day and seeing the glove beside the glass doors. It was clean. The boy had not taken it. She had picked it up, put it on, and forgotten him. That was all. A child had protected his dignity in desperation, and she had forgotten him before lunch. Elizabeth stood and walked to a vending machine. She put money in but did not press a button. She only stared at her reflection in the glass. Claire came up behind her. "She loves you," Claire said. Elizabeth did not turn. "I know." "No, you don't. Lily thinks you can fix anything. When she broke her ceramic horse, she said, 'Grandma Ellie will know what to do.' When she was afraid of the dark, she said, 'Grandma Ellie isn't scared of anything.'" Elizabeth closed her eyes. "But tonight you're scared," Claire said. "Yes." Claire was quiet for a long time. "Were you ever scared for me?" The question made Elizabeth open her eyes. She turned around. Claire stood before her, exhausted and clear-eyed, Not the little girl waiting for her mother to come home. Not the 16-year-old Elizabeth had called too sensitive. Not the grown woman who had spent years trying to love a mother who treated tenderness like a weakness. Claire was a mother asking her own mother a question that should have been answered long ago. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "I was scared for you." When? Elizabeth wanted to say many times, but memory was not kind. She remembered meetings, flights, midnight emails, tuition payments, safe neighborhoods, investment accounts. She did not remember sitting beside Claire's bed when she was feverish. She did not remember asking what Claire was afraid of. She did not remember apologizing for not being there. "Not enough," Elizabeth finally said. "I was scared, but I was not there enough for you to know it." Claire's eyes filled again. It was not forgiveness. But it was the first time Elizabeth had told the truth without trying to win. Inside the operating room, Mason met the first major complication. Pressure dropped. The monitor changed. The anesthesiologist spoke quickly. "Rhythm is unstable." One of the assisting doctors looked at the screen. "Mason, we're losing the window." "No, we're not. She may not tolerate much more." Mason did not look away from the surgical field. "Give me 2 minutes. We may not have 2 minutes. Then give me 90 seconds. The entire room seemed to breathe with his hands. Surgery is a strange thing. To outsiders, it looks like blood, machines, fear, and impossible language. To Mason, it was a conversation with time. Every heartbeat answered. Every change meant something. He could not force Lily's body to live. He could only give it a road back. 60 seconds. 80. 90. Then the monitor steadied. The nurse exhaled. The assisting doctor looked at Mason in disbelief. Mason only said, "Continue." By the 4th hour, the rain outside had stopped. By the 5th, Claire had fallen asleep in a chair, her head resting against the wall. Elizabeth removed her coat and gently placed it over her daughter's shoulders. Claire stirred, but did not push it away. Elizabeth sat down again. She looked at Claire sleeping and, for the first time in a long time, saw not an adult who needed to be strong, but a child who had been strong too often because her mother never learned how to be gentle. A nurse came by. "Mrs. Whitman?" Elizabeth stood too quickly. "Is there news?" "Not yet, but Dr. Carter asked us to let you know the surgery is still continuing." "Still continuing means there is hope?" The nurse's face softened. "Yes, it means there is hope." Hope. Elizabeth had used that word in speeches. Technology gave hope. Research gave hope. Investment gave hope. But that night, hope was simply a door that had not yet opened with bad news behind it. And she held onto it like someone poor. Near 3 in the morning, the red light above the operating room finally went out. Claire woke instantly, as if her body had never truly slept. Elizabeth stood. The doors opened. Mason Carter stepped out. His mask was pulled down. His face was deeply tired, but his eyes were not empty. Claire could not ask. Neither could Elizabeth. Mason looked at them both. Lily made it through the surgery. Claire broke. A sound came out of her that was half sob, half breath. She covered her mouth and folded into the chair. Elizabeth reached for her without thinking. Mason continued. "She will need very close monitoring for the next 24 hours, but the repair was successful. Her heart is stable." Claire cried openly. "Thank you. Thank you." Elizabeth looked at Mason. She wanted to thank him, but the words were too small. She wanted to apologize, but that too seemed too late. So she stood there,
with tears moving silently down a face that had spent a lifetime refusing to break. Mason nodded to Claire. "You'll be able to see her through the glass once we move her into recovery." Then he turned away. Elizabeth said, "Mason." For the first time, she said his name without a title. He stopped. "Thank you," she whispered. Mason looked back at her. "Don't thank me for not taking revenge." Elizabeth went still. "That's not... People will want to tell the story that way," Mason said. "That I had a chance to hurt you the way you hurt me. But that isn't what happened." He looked toward the recovery wing. "I saved a child. Not because of you, not in spite of you. Because she needed saving." Elizabeth had no answer.
Mason walked away, and Elizabeth remained in the hallway, understanding for the first time that some debts could not be paid with money, erased with gratitude, or settled by writing a check with enough zeros. Some debts could only begin to be repaid by becoming a different person. Lily woke the next afternoon. She was weak, her lips were pale, her voice was thin as paper. But when Claire leaned close and asked if she was hurting, Lily blinked and whispered, "Where's Grandma?" Elizabeth stood behind Claire, gripping the back of a chair. Claire looked at her mother. There was still exhaustion in her eyes, but the anger had moved aside for gratitude. "She's here, sweetheart." Elizabeth stepped to the bed. Lily opened her eyes. "Grandma Ellie, I'm here. Did I miss the dance?" Elizabeth laughed and cried at the same time. "Only one dance. I'm sure they'll let you perform again when you're better." Lily thought about that as if it were the most serious problem in the world. "Dr. Mason said my heart was brave." Elizabeth looked toward the door. Mason stood there with a nurse checking the chart. "He was right," Elizabeth said. "Your heart is very brave." Lily whispered, "He looks sad." Elizabeth did not know what to say. Children often see the things adults hide beneath years of practice. Mason entered the room, checked Lily's numbers, and asked her a few simple questions. His voice with the child was so gentle that Elizabeth could hardly believe it belonged to the same man who had stood in the hallway and stripped her of every defense. "You're doing very well," he told Lily. "Can I have pudding?" "We'll negotiate with your nurse." "Chocolate?" Mason pretended to think. "We should start with vanilla. Brave heart, careful stomach." Lily frowned. "Vanilla is boring." "So are surgeons. You'll survive." Claire laughed through her tears. Elizabeth watched him return a little normal life to the room. Not just survival, not just machines and numbers. Something light, something childlike. When Mason left, Elizabeth followed him. "Dr. Carter." He paused in the hallway.
Dr. Carter.
"You should rest," he said. "I need to speak with you." "Now is not the time." "For you, maybe it will never be the time." He could not deny that. "There's a small chapel on this floor," he said. 5 minutes. The hospital chapel was small. It was nothing like Boston's grand churches with high ceilings and colored glass. This room had a few wooden pews, a simple cross on the wall, and one window looking out onto a rain-dark courtyard. Mason sat in the second row. He was not praying. He was only sitting. Elizabeth entered behind him. All her life she had entered sacred spaces as a donor, an honored guest, someone invited to speak. She had sat in front rows. Her name had appeared in programs. Now she stood in the aisle and did not know what to do with her hands. "I didn't know your mother died," she said.
I did not know your mother had
"You
died."
say that as if knowing would have changed what you did." Elizabeth felt the words cut deep. "I want to believe it would have." "Do you want to believe it, or do you know?" She could not answer. Mason turned and looked at her. That was the hardest part, Mrs. Whitman. I spent years imagining that if I had said the right thing, cried harder, proved myself better, maybe you would have helped. Elizabeth folded her hands tightly. I'm sorry. Mason looked down at his own hands. I used to think that if I ever saw you again, I would say everything. I would tell you my mother's name was Margaret, that she liked mint tea, that she sang badly but still sang when she cooked, that she worked 2 jobs until her body failed. She was not lazy. His voice stayed calm, but every sentence carried weight. I would tell you she died in a hospital room that was too bright, and I was 11. Elizabeth whispered, Mason, I thought I needed you to understand all of it for that day to mean something. And now? Now I understand you were not the only reason my mother died. You were one part of a world that looked away too many times. A landlord, a pharmacy, a system, a rich woman on some steps. Each one could say, it wasn't my fault. He looked at her, and maybe each person was a little bit right, but add up enough not my fault, and someone still dies. Elizabeth sat down across the aisle. I lived my whole life that way, she said, cutting responsibility into pieces small enough that none of them kept me awake. Mason did not answer. I thought if I worked hard, if I succeeded, if I never asked anyone for anything, then I had earned the right to judge those who couldn't do the same. She looked at the cross, though she was not sure who she was speaking to. I called that strength. No, Mason said. It was fear wearing a good suit. Elizabeth let out a small, painful laugh. Maybe it was. Silence settled between them. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight, she said. I don't think I have the right. But I need you to know that I am truly sorry. Mason looked at her for a long time. When my mother died, I hated you. Elizabeth did not look away. I understand. No, you don't. I hated your shoes. I hated your building. I hated your name when I saw it in newspapers. Once, I saw a story about you donating money to a hospital, and I threw the paper away. She closed her eyes. But hatred is a very small room, Mason said. If you live in it long enough, you become something you never meant to be. Your mother saved you from that. She tried. And you let her. For the first time, something in his face softened. Elizabeth took a shaky breath. Why did you save Lily? Mason looked out the window. In the courtyard, an old maple tree had lost most of its leaves. A few copper-colored ones still clung to wet branches. Because Lily is not you, he said. Because a child should not pay for what adults fail to become. And because kindness is not a reward for the deserving. He turned back to Elizabeth. It is a choice. Elizabeth lowered her head. It was the simplest thing she had ever heard. And the hardest thing she had ever been asked to live. Before Mason left the chapel, Elizabeth asked, What can I do? He stopped at the door. If you're asking so you can feel less guilty, nothing. She nodded. And if I'm asking because I really want to begin again? Mason looked at her. Then don't build a wall with your name on it. Find the people standing outside the door before it's too late. Then he left. Elizabeth remained in the chapel for a long time. For once, she did not think about public image or damage control or how to keep the story from reaching the press. She thought about a boy in the snow, a mother named Margaret, a returned leather glove, and a question that had arrived 20 years too late. How many lives might have changed
if she had stopped for 1 minute.
The story of Lily's surgery did not appear in the news right away. Elizabeth made sure of that, not to protect herself, but because Claire asked for privacy while her daughter recovered. For once, Elizabeth did not argue. She simply said, "Of course." A small answer, but Claire looked at her longer than usual. Over the next weeks, Lily recovered slowly but steadily. Mason checked on her every day. He was not warm with Elizabeth, but he was not cruel either. Between them stood a careful distance built from memory and held in place by truth. One morning, Lily was coloring in bed when she asked, "Dr. Mason, do you have kids?" Mason smiled.
Dr. Mason,
"Not yet."
have kids?
"Then how do you know how to talk to kids?" "Because surgeons are a little like kids. We need naps, we like snacks, and we get very upset when people touch our special tools." Lily giggled. Elizabeth stood outside the doorway and heard him. Mason looked up and saw her. He said nothing. She did not enter. She only stood there for a moment, then walked away. On the day Lily was discharged, Boston had a little sunshine after days of rain. Claire zipped Lily's coat. Lily held a stuffed rabbit in one arm, her hospital bracelet still around her wrist. Elizabeth waited beside the car. She did not rush anyone. In the past, she had rushed everyone. Move faster, decide faster, sign faster, heal faster. Now, she was learning how to stand still when someone else needed time. Mason came to say goodbye at the entrance. "Remember your medication schedule," he told Lily. She nodded seriously. "And no racing anyone for 2 weeks. Can we make it 3? Claire asked. Lily gasped. "Mom?" Mason said, "Listen to your mother. She's scarier than a surgeon." Lily whispered, "Not scarier than Grandma." Claire laughed. So did Elizabeth, softly. Lily hugged Mason. He stiffened for half a second, then bent down and gently patted her back. "Thank you for fixing my heart," Lily said. Mason answered, "Thank you for letting it keep beating." Elizabeth watched, her throat tight. When Claire helped Lily into the car, Elizabeth stayed behind. "Mason," he turned. "I want to start a fund." Mason did not look surprised. "I thought you might." "It will not have my name on it." That made him look at her more closely. "Whose name?" "Margaret Carter." The cold wind moved across the hospital entrance. Mason was silent. Elizabeth continued, "I have spoken with some doctors, but I want to hear from you. What should it do?" Mason had every right to doubt her. A woman like Elizabeth did not change because of one painful night. A woman like her could turn guilt into branding very easily if she was not careful. But that day, he did not see someone looking for a stage. He saw someone looking for work to do after an apology had proven too small. "There is a window where poor people are most easily lost," he said. "Not after the diagnosis is official, not once the paperwork is in the system. Before that, when they know something is wrong, but they don't have the money, the transportation, the documents, or anyone who believes them." Elizabeth listened. The first night, the first day, the first prescription, the first ride to the hospital, that small gap can kill people. She nodded. Then the fund should focus on the first 24 hours. Not only children, Mason said. Parents too. If my mother had been helped sooner, maybe... He stopped. Elizabeth did not interrupt. "Call it the Emergency First Light Fund," he said. "But if you want to use my mother's name, ask me again in 6 months. Don't use her pain while both of us are still emotional." Elizabeth looked at him. That was the difference between a real act and a quick attempt at redemption. "All right," she said. 6 months.
Mason nodded. And if you create it, let community clinic workers decide who needs help, not a board of people in suits sitting behind glass walls. Elizabeth almost smiled. You don't like glass walls? I've had some bad experiences with them. It was not quite a joke, but it was close enough for both of them to understand that the past was still there, though it no longer controlled the entire room. 6 months later, Elizabeth Whitman did something no one in business expected. She stepped away from direct leadership at Whitman Medical Technologies. The newspapers guessed at reasons: health, pressure, boardroom conflict. She did not respond. At her final board meeting, one member said, "Elizabeth, are you sure you want to shift your focus to community work now? Your legacy is at its peak." Elizabeth looked at him. Legacy is not what gets carved into a building. It is what remains in other people's lives after we leave the room. The boardroom went quiet. Some people thought she had become soft. They were wrong. For the first time, kindness had not weakened Elizabeth. It had made her brave. The fund opened 1 year after Lily's surgery. Its official name was the Margaret Carter First Light Fund. Mason had agreed after many conversations, not because he had fully forgiven Elizabeth, but because he understood that his mother's name, used correctly, could open a door for people like her. The fund had 3 purposes. First, to pay for emergency prescriptions during the first 24 hours for families who could not afford them. Second, to provide transportation to hospitals and clinics for low-income patients, especially single mothers and children. Third, to support a night clinic in South Boston where people could come before their problems became emergencies. Elizabeth refused to put her own name at the entrance. The only plaque in the waiting room read, "For Margaret Carter, and for every person who should have been helped sooner." No portrait of Elizabeth, no giant company logo. Just a clean reception desk, a few rows of chairs, a small play corner for children, and hot water always ready for anyone who needed it. On opening day, Boston was cold again. Mason stood in front of the clinic wearing a long coat, a short speech in his hand. Elizabeth stood in the front row, but off to one side, like an ordinary guest. Claire and Lily were there too. Lily was much stronger now, with her hair tied in 2 small ponytails. In her hand was a drawing of a red heart with yellow wings. Mason looked at the sign bearing his mother's name. For a moment, he was not a renowned surgeon. He was an 11-year-old boy who had not had enough money for medicine. Then he began. My mother was not important in the way the world usually measures importance. She did not own a company. She did not have a prestigious degree. She did not have savings. But she taught me the most important thing I know about medicine before I ever entered medical school. He looked out at the crowd. She taught me that a person should not have to prove they deserve to be saved while they are trying to survive. Elizabeth lowered her head. Mason continued. This clinic does not exist to turn kindness into a performance. It exists to do something very simple: to stop sooner, to answer sooner, to believe sooner. Because sometimes what saves a family is not a miracle. It is a prescription filled on time, a ride to the hospital, a person at the front desk saying, "We will help." He paused. My mother used to say, the world wins when it makes good people hard. I hope this place helps at least a few people avoid becoming hard, just to survive. No one clapped immediately. Some speeches need applause.
Others need silence first. Then Claire clapped. Then Lily. Then everyone. Elizabeth did not clap right away. She wiped her eyes first. After the ceremony, a young woman stepped into the clinic holding a boy of about 8. His face was pale, and he was coughing hard. The woman's coat was thin. Her hair was tangled from the wind. Her eyes had the frightened look of someone prepared to hear the words, "Not enough money," again. She glanced around uncertainly. "I'm sorry, I don't know if you're open today. My son needs medicine, but I don't get paid until Friday." Elizabeth was standing near the reception desk. For one small moment, time folded in on itself. Old snow on stone steps, a boy with newspapers, a mother who needed medicine, a pair of dirty shoes. Elizabeth walked over. The young woman took a half-step back, perhaps because Elizabeth still looked like someone important. But Elizabeth crouched down to the boy's level. "What's your name?" "Ben," he whispered. "Ben, we're going to have a doctor see you. Your mother does not need to worry about money tonight." The woman's eyes widened. "I can pay later. I just need a few days." Elizabeth looked at her. "Tonight, you need to take care of your son. We'll talk about the rest later." The woman began to cry, not loudly, just the kind of tears that fall after a long day of trying not to break. Elizabeth handed her a tissue. This time, the tissue was not for a shoe. It was for a person. Mason stood at the end of the hallway and saw it. He did not smile exactly, but his eyes softened. Lily ran to Mason and lifted her drawing. "Dr. Mason, I made this for you." He accepted it. In the picture, the red heart had a tiny bandage across the middle and yellow wings on both sides. "It's beautiful," Mason said. "Grandma says hearts don't have to be perfect to fly." Mason looked toward Elizabeth. She was sitting beside the young mother now, listening while the woman explained cut work hours, rent, and her son's fever. Elizabeth did not interrupt. She did not judge. She did not turn suffering into a lesson. She only listened. Mason looked back at the drawing. "Your grandma is right." Lily tilted her head. "Are you still sad?" The question caught him off guard. Children are inconvenient that way. They often place their hands on the exact wound adults have learned to hide. Mason lowered himself to Lily's height.
"Are you still sad?"
"Sometimes." "Because of your mom?" Mason was quiet. "Yes, because of my mom." Lily placed a small hand on his shoulder. "Maybe she likes the clinic." Mason looked up at the sign. Maybe she would. Not because her name was on a wall. Margaret Carter had never needed that. She would like it because inside this place, a child would not have to stand in the snow trying to convince adults that his mother deserved to live. Mason said softly, "Yes, I think she would." Another year passed. Then another. The Margaret Carter First Light Fund did not stay in the headlines forever. The cameras moved on. Donors found shinier places to be seen. But the clinic stayed open. On winter nights, a delivery driver brought in his daughter during an asthma attack. On cold mornings, an elderly woman got help paying for heart medication before she had to choose between pills and heat. On rainy afternoons, teenagers brought sick parents to the clinic with fear in their eyes and no idea what would happen next. At the front desk, a small sign always remained. "Tell us what you need first. We'll talk about payment later." Elizabeth came to the clinic every Thursday.
At first, the staff grew nervous when she arrived. They called her Mrs. Whitman. They stood straighter. They checked their paperwork twice. But over time, they learned she was not there to inspect them. She was there to work. She made coffee, organized books in the children's corner, helped people fill out insurance forms, called pharmacies, sat with elderly patients while they waited for rides. One day, a new staff member who did not recognize her asked her to mop up a spill near the entrance. Elizabeth picked up the mop. Claire walked in at that exact moment and froze. "Mom?" Elizabeth looked at the mop, then at her daughter. "It appears I've been promoted." Claire burst out laughing. Not polite laughter, real laughter. A sound Elizabeth realized she had missed for far too many years. Their relationship did not heal because of one surgery or one fund. Some cracks need time. Claire still had angry days. Elizabeth still slipped into old habits of control. But now, when Claire said, "Mom, you're doing it again," Elizabeth learned to stop. Not perfectly, but she stopped. Forgiveness did not come easily for Mason either. Some days he passed Whitman Tower and felt his throat tighten. Some days he saw polished black heels and remembered the icy steps. Some nights, after a difficult surgery, he heard his mother's voice and felt like an 11-year-old boy who had not made it to the pharmacy in time. But there were other days, too. Days when a child left the hospital alive. Days when a mother said, "I don't know what we would have done without this clinic." Days when he saw Elizabeth Whitman at the reception desk, patiently helping an old man fill out a form, her voice so gentle that anyone who had known her 20 years earlier would not have believed it. One late autumn afternoon, Mason found Elizabeth sitting alone in the clinic waiting room, looking out the window. Leaves moved across the sidewalk outside. "Are you tired?" he asked. She turned. "At my age, that is no longer a question. It is a permanent condition." Mason smiled faintly and sat beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. Elizabeth said, "A boy came in today, 12 years old. His mother needed insulin. He tried to act grown, but his hands kept shaking while he signed the forms." Mason looked at her. "Did you help?" "Yes." She paused. "Then I went into the restroom and cried." Mason said nothing. "I didn't cry because it was sad," she said. "I cried because I realized how easy it was. Just say yes. Just don't let suspicion be your first reflex." Mason looked out the window. "It isn't always easy." "I know. Do you?" Elizabeth nodded slowly. "More than I did. Some people will take advantage. Some cases are complicated. Some limits are real. But I used all of that complexity as an excuse not to see the person in front of me." She turned to him. "Mason, I don't know if you will ever fully forgive me. I don't know either. But I want you to know that every time this place helps someone, I think of your mother. Not to punish myself, to remember that she was not just part of my mistake. She was a person. Margaret, a mother, a woman who raised a son better than any of us deserved." Mason lowered his head. For a moment he could not speak. Elizabeth did not rush to fill the silence anymore. That was something else she had learned. Not every quiet space needed to be controlled. Finally, Mason said, "My mother used to sing badly." Elizabeth looked at him. "You told me that in the chapel." She would sing while she cooked. Same song, same wrong note, every time.
He gave a small laugh and his eyes turned red. I hated that song after she died. For a long time. And now? Now I listen to it sometimes. Elizabeth nodded. Is that forgiveness? Mason thought about it. No, I think that's living. She looked at him with sadness and gratitude. Maybe living is the best we can do before we learn how to forgive. That evening, when Mason left the clinic, the first snow of the season began to fall. Not much, just a few thin white flakes drifting through the streetlight. He stood beneath the awning and pulled his collar up. A car stopped in front of the clinic. A mother stepped out carrying a small child. Her shoulder was wet with snow, and as she struggled with her bag, a bottle of medicine fell onto the ground. Mason bent to pick it up. At the same moment, Elizabeth stepped out from inside. She bent down too. Their hands reached the bottle at the same time. For one heartbeat, time became a circle. 20 years earlier, a leather glove had fallen on stone steps. A boy had picked it up. A woman had not stopped. Now, a bottle of medicine had fallen outside a clinic, and both of them stopped. Elizabeth let Mason pick up the bottle, then turned to the mother. "Come inside," she said. "It's warmer in here." The woman hesitated. "I'm not sure I can afford—" Elizabeth gently interrupted her, not to silence her this time, to remove the fear from her shoulders sooner. "Tell us what you need first." Mason looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked back. There was no apology in her eyes, no plea to be forgiven, only a quiet promise repeated through one small action. Mason opened the door for the woman and child. Warm light spilled out from the clinic. Elizabeth followed them inside. Mason remained outside for one more second as snow fell over Boston. He thought of his mother, of the old steps, of the sentence that had followed him for 20 years. Kindness is not for people who refuse to help themselves. Then he thought of another sentence. Kindness is not a reward. It is a choice. Maybe people cannot go back and save everything they lost. No one could bring Margaret Carter back. No one could turn the 11-year-old boy outside Whitman Tower into a child who had been helped in time. No one could erase a sentence that had wounded a life. But people can do something else. They can stop at the next door. They can listen before judging. They can help before it is too late. They can let pain turn them not into stone, but into a hand reaching for someone else. Mason stepped into the clinic. Behind him, snow continued to fall over Boston, covering old sidewalks, cold steps, and the shoes of people walking through the city with stories no one could see. Inside, the clinic lights glowed warm against the night, not bright enough to impress anyone, not grand enough to make headlines, just warm enough for one desperate person to know that this time, someone had seen them. And sometimes, that is where a miracle begins. For years, Elizabeth Whitman believed kindness had to be earned. She believed poor people needed lessons, weak people needed discipline, and anyone who had fallen behind must have made the wrong choices somewhere along the way. But life brought her back to the boy she had once left in the snow. Only this time, he was no longer standing outside with old newspapers in his arms. He was wearing a white coat. He had the hands steady enough to save her granddaughter's heart. And he had a heart soft enough not to become the woman she had been. The lesson of this story is not simply that cruelty comes back around.
It is that small moments can change entire lives. One sentence can wound someone for 20 years. One hand extended at the right time can save a family. One pause, one act of mercy, one choice to listen before judging can become the line between despair and hope. So if you ever meet someone standing at the edge of their own life, do not ask first whether they deserve help. Ask the simpler question: what do they need? Because kindness is not a prize for perfect people. Kindness is a choice. And when that choice arrives in time, it may save more than one life. It may save the human part of us, too.